Hi there, hello, my name's Lines, great to see you. Now, today we're going to be talking about line art. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do line art, and we'll be covering a few of them. Before we get stuck in, I want to let you know first, there's 2 free brushes for you linked in the description. One is just an effect brush to save you a bit of time with the contour lines, and we'll talk about what that is later down the video. The other is the brush I'll be using for all the sketching, the line art, the shading, and the blocking out in this video. And if you watch to the end of the video to see how it's made, I'll even reveal the super duper secret of this brush that contains the source of all my artistic powers. Now, one other thing before we get stuck in, of course, if you like the video, hit like, subscribe, the bell, the dog, the shoe, little race car. Some of those might be Monopoly pieces, but yeah, press whatever buttons you like. You can also consider becoming a member on the Patreon if you want to more directly support the channel and get access to things like the PSD files or the images from the Speedpaint sections. And there's also classes that I run. So the pilot program for that is going great. We'll likely have a new intake in the early part of next year once some spots open up, so do keep an eye out for that. Now, once you've watched the video, and if you want to have a go yourself, there's a homework sheet I've made for you to have a go of. See how you go, post in the Discord, and I'll try to get in every few days and give feedback on all the homework submitted. Now, there's a few of you at the moment, possibly more than 4, so catch up can take a little while sometimes, so I appreciate your patience. But let's get stuck in then with all the different kinds of line art we'll be covering. So these are the kinds of line art we'll be covering today. So we'll start off with doing ambient occlusion line art. This is where you make little bits darker, where it's hard for light to get in, the ambient light to get in, to little recesses or between objects that are close together. After that then, we'll talk about how to separate objects from each other with thick line art based on how far apart the objects are. We'll also touch briefly on using line art to talk about the primary lighting direction. This is not one I use very often myself, but it can work really well with artists like Mobius using it to great effect. Now, another thing you do with line art, not just showing the lighting, is also use it to do things like implied texture, where instead of using a tone or anything else, you'll use your line art to talk about where the texture is on the object, but you won't have to draw it over the entire object, learning where to do it and where to stop, so you can use your line art or your black fill to show where texture and detail is. After that then, we'll also talk about contour lines. This is similar to your implied detail. It's where you use line art to add tone, but you also use it to show the shape of the object by running it along the contours of where that object would be. And I'll include the little brush that does that to save you a bit of time. Next, something can be quite handy is how to do colored line art. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but I'll go through how to use your filled color to pretty much automatically color in your line art. It'll get you about 90% of the way there, and it's just a great way to get that done and save you a bit of time if you want to do that a lot, and how to turn your flats into your colored line art. And those are the ones we'll have there. So we'll have ambient occlusion, distance from object, lighting, implied texture, contour, and colored line art. So then with that, let's begin. So we'll have a sketch here of a character. Now, we want to make sure they're not just in like a T-pose, because you want some parts of them to overlap. Not just things like the hair overlapping the face, but we're going to want things like parts of the body overlapping other parts of the body. So in this case here, we'll have things like the arm behind the boob on the left there, and we'll have a bit of a jacket that's sort of half off. Now, once we've got the sketch done, we're going to start with the naive line art. So this is just a brush, decent amount of smoothing, and then we'll go nice, smooth strokes. We don't have to worry about the thickness. If you're confident with it, you can start doing your line art thickness variation at this step if you like. I like to keep mine separate personally, but if you're confident you know where you want the thickest lines to be and the thinnest lines to be, you can just jump straight in and do it. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to do this, which I'll call sort of the naive line art, where it's all the same thickness, and then we'll be building on top of it with thicker parts of tone and shading and so forth, using just our line art. And so we'll go for a sort of a retro look with this one, and don't worry too much about the fills, like things like where the eyelashes would have dark fills. And don't worry as well if some of the forms look a bit wacky. You can always fix them up by using the lasso and free transform tools to put things into the right shapes and places. And we're just going to get the basic forms here, and we can come back in and do detail whenever we want it to. So we'll get the jacket in and the lines for things like the body. Normally a lot of those I probably would do with tone instead of line art, but with this being a line art tutorial, I'm going to be using line art for a lot more than I usually do. And it can do really well for that too. But some of these I would probably use tone for typically, but we're just going to be using line art and won't be doing shading in this one, except when we get into how to use contour and implied texture. So that's our naive line art. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to colorize that so it's easier for me to see the next layer. So I'll get this, I'll make a new layer, and I'll colorize the naive line art just so I can visually tell it apart from each other. This is handy in a couple of ways. It'll tell me firstly where I have and haven't done the extra thickness to the line art, but it's also good to keep them on separate layers so that you can quickly switch the naive line art on and off, and you can see where you have or have not added the thickness to the line art and where you may have forgotten it. So just adding it there to wherever the light would have trouble reaching. So like you can see there, I've put it between like the bits of hair, anywhere the light's going to have trouble getting into little creasy inside details. That's where we want these dark bits here. And since they're based off the ambient light, not the cast light, or cast shadow, sorry, they're going to be neutral for things like where you want your cast lights and surface shadows to be, since your ambient light is a different light source to your direct light, which I talk about that one a bit more in the lighting tutorial, so I'll link that one up on screen now if you want to go through there, where I talk about the different kinds of lighting. Now with that, that's our ambient occlusion done, and those are the little dark bits there. Next we want to do the separation. So we'll have the line art be a lot thicker based on how far it is from the object behind it. In this case, you can see I'm doing the line art around the entire object. That's because the furthest distance is between this object and the background. So there's also internal separation I want to make, but I don't want it to be as thick as the line art I've used to separate it from the background. So it'll be thicker than the naive line art, but it'll be thinner than the line art I've used to separate it from the background. So this is a good way to have internal division and depth, while also having a much stronger division between it and the background. And then I've merged them together, and you can see now I've got some pretty nice line art. So let's do some quick fills, and I'll go over how to do some colored line art. So I'll just do a basic sort of color scheme there. I'll do pink hair, and then I'll go an opposite color for things like the shirt and the skirt or pants, whatever they are. And I'll expand the fill out. So I've got a new layer with my flats, and I've expanded it out. Because what I want it to do is have it come out all the way and have no gaps. So I'm going to use the line art width control in Clip Studio. In Photoshop, the filter you want is called like minimum. A lot of programs have it. And so I'll select everything that's outside the line art and clip off all that excess. So don't worry about making it come out and bleed out well past your line art. You can just clip off the excess. Now, what I'll do is I'll get all my different line art, because I had them all on different layers. So I've got my naive line art, I've got my ambient occlusion line art, I've got my thickness line art. I'll merge all of them together into one, because I want to use them all unified so I can have an effect applied to them, which is going to be that coloring, which I'll do with a copy of my flats layer. And I'll make sure, of course, that I don't forget to include a copy of the naive line art merged in as well. Now once I've got that, I'm going to get a copy of my flats, I'll duplicate that layer, and I'll give it a name to tell me that it's different from the flats I'll be using for my image. I'll take the hue and saturation both down by about 20 as a starting point. I'll probably tune it later, but that'll give me a darker color and also a different color. I want some color variation. I don't just want it to be a sort of more gray version of the existing color. I want a bit of a hue shift to help separate it. I'll change the blend mode there on the layer to, or you can use screen, either will work. And now that I've got that, there'll be a few little extra bits I've got to fix up. Now this is a lot quicker than going over and just brushing in color over all the line art. Instead, I'm just going to correct out and remove and fix up some of the parts that didn't quite come out with the automatic process. This is why I said before that it'll get you 90% of the way there. Depending how you do your flats, it can get you a bit closer, but this is a good way to save yourself a bit of time and get your line art colored most of the way there and just correct a few bits. Also worth considering where you want what colors to go over the top of other colors. So for instance here, I've decided I want the arm to be the dominant color. And then I'll do the rim of the pants there and the rim of the skirt in black, sort of carve them out. So whatever color or whatever object is in front, I'll use that object's color to color the line art. because again, the image itself can't know that, so you will have to do those little bits of adjustment. And now I'm just doing a bit of change to the color to make sure it's tuned in right. And then I might even do just a quick bit of highlighting to show off where the shape would be. I'll even pale the fills a little bit more so we can give a bit more focus to that colored line art. And you can see there, that's a very easy way of turning your fills into line art. Now, let's talk about implied texture. So with this ball here, we're going to give it some texture. So we'll do it all the way around. We'll make it really rocky and craggy. What that means is I'm having to do detail over the entire surface of it. I don't have any gaps. I have to do the whole thing, and it can be very time intensive. It can look cool, but it can also look a little bit flat and take a bit of effort. Instead, what I can do is I'll split it up into different zones. I'll have a zone with no texture, a zone with some texture, and a zone with full texture. And it will look like the entire thing has texture. So you can see here, as I do the texture out and have it drop off, the object itself still looks rocky and bumpy, even though I've only drawn it on about a third to half of it. Now the same thing is doable on a figure. So here, I'm going to do a dragon girl, and we're going to have really, really bumpy, rough, sticky outy scales. I want them to look like it covers the entire character, but I don't actually want to draw it. So I'm going to do the figure out first, and then I'll do the implied texture. It's worth remembering that implied texture is probably the best texture because since it happens in the mind of the viewer, it's perfect. So I'll use some on things like the shoulder here, and I'll have some big scales. I'll have that zone, and then I'll have a zone with smaller scales. And as I move further from that central point, I won't draw them as much. I'll maybe draw a couple of lines, maybe some bumps on the edge, like the outline. And that'll imply that the whole thing has scales. And as I do more, I'll define some more zones, like along the face, along the cheeks. And I'll do the detail in, but you can see as I get further from those zones I've decided on, I'll have less and less detail on those scales. I'll try and sort of have them the pattern match those little sort of tiley scales you get around the eyes. And so here I'll do on the other shoulder as well, and remember having it die off as it gets further away from those central points. So I want to have the whole thing look like it's scaly, but I'm not actually going to do scales on the whole thing. I'm going to allude to a lot of it. And so, the same patterning down the front, that sort of lizard underbelly scale pattern. And then I'll do some on the hips here, just a few focal points. And that'll sort of allude to the rest of it, maybe a bit on the tail as well here. So I'll do some really big detailed sort of spikes and then a few little detailed bits, and then also some little sections there to communicate that the whole thing is texture. But you can see there, the areas in red are where the scales actually are, but that only takes up a small amount of the figure itself. So now let's translate that into line art. So, like we did before, we're going to go over and do our naive line art. This has no line weight variation, plenty of smoothing, just getting it all out. And we'll adjust that once we've got all of it down. And you can see here, it does take a minute to do all these details of the scales here. That's one of the reasons why implied detail is so useful. It means you're not doing that over the entire thing. Like I had an illustration of a snake I had to do back at uni, and it took quite a while to go through and do all of the scales. If I'd had a better understanding of implied detail, I would have done just some scales on either the mid-tone or shadow areas, and that would have done the job just as well. So now I've got the naive line art. I'll just quickly go over how to do line art that demonstrates lighting direction. You can see this one will show up a lot better on the Speedpaint preview on the left-hand side there, where you can see it does give the character a bit of depth. But this one really does need to be done in concert with shading, because without it, you can see it sort of separates the objects out, but it can sort of tend to flatten them a bit. You'll also need to remember to thin some of the line art towards the light source, to the point where you may even need to remove it to really push that effect and make sure it really works. So you can thicken it as the surfaces are further from the light source, facing wise, and thin it as they face more towards the light source. Now, turning that off, let's go over and do, like we did before, the ambient occlusion lighting pass. And this is going to work really well with scales as well, because in between the scales, if they're rough and bumpy, you'll see that they'll have little dark shadows in between them. If you imagine them being lit by a really soft light, they'll gradually get darker as they get in between each of the scales. And so adding those, not just on the scales, but on the body as per usual, and you can see how much they add to the texture of them, even though, again, the character themselves only has a few little spots of texture. But if we characterize those spots of texture well, we do some ambient occlusion on them, and we have them die off and get less detail as they get further out, that can really help communicate that the whole thing has that same texture on it. So with that done then, I'm going to go over and add some tone to it. And it's just some basic shading. Again, this is using that one of the two special brushes that's linked in the description, which I'll get to the secret of. This is the Brushemi brush. And I'm just going to do a lot of drop shadows here. Similar to how implied texture can really give you a lot of sort of image information without a lot of effort. Drop shadows are probably one of the other easy ways to get a lot of depth and form without having to do a lot of effort. You'll notice that in anime, it's all the drop shadows. So then, we've got that one done. So, next, let's go into contour. So, I'll get a fairly realistic looking head for this one, being viewed from the side. I was going over with one of the students, recommending they read some Sin City by Frank Miller, which is just an absolutely gorgeous graphic novel. Very mature subject matter, as you get, but it's still absolutely beautiful use of black and white. So with that in mind, I've decided to use this for then contour. So I'll start with the head, and I'll block out where I'm planning to have my areas of hard black, hard white, and then in between. I'll do some patterning here for things like cracks in a sort of stony statue of a head. Now once I've got those, and I like where they're sort of positioned, the next thing I'll do is I'll do some line art. Now I'll do the thickened line art based on the distance to the object behind it. So in this case, you can see that outline of the figure is thicker line art than the internal shapes, since the internal shapes don't have a bigger distance to the object behind them. And now once I've got those in there, the next thing I'll do is start blocking out the darkest colors. This is the black areas, so that's why I have those two levels of shading on it. So I want to have some really, really hard black and some really, really hard white, and I'm going to use contour in between the two as a sort of transitional area of both tone, and since it's contour, it'll also be a really great way of exploring the shape of the object, in this case the figure's head, to really sort of communicate that, and also give me that depth of tone. Now I've got a special brush for this one. Essentially it does dots, and the light pressure means the dots are further apart. Heavy pressure means the dots will sit closer together to the point where if you push hard enough, it'll become a solid line. And this is a really great way to have contour lines that can also function as tone when added to the figure. And so here, just gently going from one to the other. I can put the smoothing up on the brush too. Contour is really good for having the shape of something described. You essentially get your midtones to do double duty as both a way of describing the lighting, but also as a way of more directly describing the shapes. And so you can follow the contour of things. Like you can see here around the nostril, I'm doing nice sort of round shapes to follow that contour of that part of the face, in that case the nose. Let's do the head along the top, and a bit more around the ears as well. The more complicated areas will require a lot more contour, so things like the ears and the nose, whereas things like the broad side of the head and the cheek, they're fairly simple repeating lines, but some of those parts will need a lot more detail than others. And so here I'm just doing the bit around the neck and over the shoulder there. Now that's where I've added black on white, but the next thing I want to do is also start carving out some white from the hard black. So I'll essentially use that same brush, I'll switch it to erasing mode, where it'll function as an eraser now, and I'll start carving contours out of the black areas of the head, so I can have those same contour lines continue into the black. I don't really need as many because I want to keep the black intact. And then you can see for the broken bit of the underside there, it's also great for alluding to that also. So with that, I've got hard white, hard black, and some transitional as well. So I've got some contour lines that are also giving me tone to go between the two. Now, next thing I want to do is the final image, where we're going to put a few of these together. So I'll start with a figure here. I'm just going to get the basic forms in. I'm not going to worry too much about detailing. I just want to make sure it looks nice inside the sort of circular shape. I'm going to go for a sort of Celtic patterning around it, which is a good way to explore things like line art and tone. If you're doing a piece that's really heavy on line art, there's a lot of existing, art forms like, Celtic knot patterns that are really great explorations of what you can do with flat colors and line art. And so here I've done the basic sketch. I'm just going to go over and do a refined one. One thing I see a lot of people doing is they'll try to get the line right perfect first time. What I find can work better is instead of Control-Z to get rid of what you've drawn, leave what you've drawn and just erase it slightly. That way you're still building on the near miss. So you might be drawing a line and it's not quite in the right spot, but just erase it a little, build on it, learn from it, and keep it there so you can not waste the effort instead of just going Control-Z 20 times. Have a few strokes, find the line, erase it out and find it, and get closer each time. And so now I'm just getting the shapes for what I want for things like the hair and the shoulders. And I want some sort of fairly detailed stuff around the top of the head and the shoulders and the waistband there. Sort of like a Celtic kimono obi. Sort of very cross-cultural mixed thing. And so maybe some bangles there is a good excuse to put some tone in, because with this I'm not going to be putting down any shading or color. It's all going to be line art and maybe contour lines as well. So once I've got the detail of the hand out there, I'll start building around the rest of it. And so I'll sort of start tuning that in, adding the detail. One thing that's also really worth being aware of is you're having a very sort of line art intensive piece. Line art can be very, very time consuming. Be prepared for things like stippling or contour lines to really eat up a decent amount of your day. With this video, all the stuff together is probably around 10-15 hours worth of footage pushed down into this. So there's a lot condensed into this. A lot of time can be spent getting all these drawings done if they're all based on line art. Because line art is one of the more time-consuming parts. Whereas you can just dump in flats with a bucket fill, and you can do shading with a fairly large brush and get them out of the way quite readily. And so now I'm doing a bit of detailing on the hands and arms. Now I wanted to have them be a bit paler than the rest. And I'm just getting the lasso tool, moving a few things around to make sure I'm in the right spot, and planning where I want the flow of the hair. You can see here I'm being very loose with it. I'm not worried too much about sort of where the final line art and everything will go. I just want to make sure my basic ideas for the composition are in the right spots. And I want some hair to come out beyond the circle. And I've also got some, you can see the blue and red circular shapes there. I've just grabbed the shape tool, dropped them in there just to sort of give me a guide on where an exact circle should be. I won't draw in actual, like use the circle tool, just because it'll give me a fairly mechanical and inorganic line, like it'll be perfect. And I actually kind of want the imperfections, that irregularity that comes with a thing that has been drawn. So I'll use it as a guide and I'll draw over the top of it, but I'm not going to have it as the actual line, just because I want that irregularity that comes from a thing that you have drawn. And so I'm doing the various shapes here. I've got the little sort of 3 swirly one. I've got the one from, I think, from Charmed. It's probably something else, but that's what I remember it from. And then that sort of X shape that has the knot along the line along the top, and just cloning that out because there's no sense drawing it twice. And then getting some of the detail on here, and then getting rid of some of it. So it's worth, like for instance, with a complicated shape like that, to draw the whole thing in and then be comfortable to erase it. It can often be a lot harder to try and draw things around gaps rather than just draw it and then erase over it for the bits that get overlapped. The line art you'll have underneath will still be easier to understand and easier to do than trying to sort of work in just the gaps available between an object that's overlapping it. Now with that, I'm also going to do things like draw out the pattern off to the side here for the shoulder, And then I'm going to free transform it onto the figure, but it's much easier to get sort of my head around working on it flat somewhere else, and then I can just sort of free transform it on instead of trying to work with it already in perspective. If you can sort of compartmentalize work out for yourself into smaller and more simple tasks, then I highly recommend you do. And then I decided I want to sort of get a bit of detail on the hair there, and a bit more around the eyes. And again, I won't be using tone in the final image. I'm just sort of marking out where I want to have the image look darker, which I'll have to do with things like contour or more line art as well. And so now I'm neatening up that line around the edge there, using that big blue circle as my guide to make sure it sort of lands right. And then adding some more patterns in to connect the background sort of runy circly knot things. I'm trying to be fairly regular with it. Again, I'm doing it fairly freeform because I don't have to worry too much about it being exactly accurate. Most of it's covered by the figure and their hair, so however it ends up, it'll look fine. And so I'm doing some locks of the hair coming down the front there. And I might have to do one on the other side also, on the other side of the face. Now, with that, I could probably start doing the line art. So just like we did before, I'll have my line art layer, and I'll try and do nice, simple, smooth lines. I have a lot of brush smoothing on when I draw line art, just because I don't have a very steady hand, and that's not a sort of thing I can build up. My hands are going to be just shaky forever. And so I'm just going to go for nice, big, smooth ones for all the line art there. Brush smoothing is fine. It can make things feel a bit sort of gluey. So find the amount that you're sort of comfortable with. I have to put a lot on there because, again, my hands are fairly shaky. And I have to worry about some of these looking a bit sort of naive. And so I'll just do the rest of the line art out there. Again, like I said before, a piece like this that's very, very line art heavy is very, very time consuming. So I'll just speed through a lot of this, but you can see the same process of the naive line art. It's just going over the whole thing. One thing that can really help save a lot of time is trying where you can to work from one area to another area. So like top down, left to right, whatever it is, it'll stop you having time spent hunting down those last little bits that you've missed. And here I'm trying to do the line art on the patterning on the arms in a thinner ink, just so it looks a bit sort of paler. Because if you use too much line art, it'll make things look dark. Now, get the last little bits in. Now here you can see I'm doing that same ambient occlusion, where anywhere the light has trouble reaching, I'm going to make that bit a bit darker. So especially around things like this flower here that looks like a waratah. I'm doing little dark spots there where the light would have trouble getting between the little petals of it. And the same thing here on the leaves, where they'll be occluded by each other and that ambient light won't be able to get in. But remembering this is just about the ambient light, not about the direct light from the light source. This is just the ambient sort of gassy light that floats around. And a bit more under there. And then around the hair, especially where the hair folds in on itself. Anywhere we get two things coming close to each other, that will decrease the amount of ambient light you can have coming in from all the other angles. So those are really some of your easy spots to add that, and they add a lot of depth. And they sort of simulate that base level of lighting. Even in very soft or bright light, you'll still have a lot of it. And so then, doing it over the rest of the image, so I'll speed this bit up as well. And so you can see there, I'm just sort of trying to move from one area to another area and be relatively methodical, even though the thing is a big sort of circle. I'm trying to sort of cover one bit before I do the next. And there'll be a lot of work on it to do on things like those armbands with lots of little corners, because it's those corners where you'll be adding those bits of extra darkness for your ambient occlusion, for adding thickness to your line art. And especially with things like with the Celtic knots and so forth, where one line goes over the top of the other, it'll have sort of ambient shadow underneath it, and then also on the hair as well. And so that's the naive line art and the ambiently occluded line art shading done as well. Now that's typically what I'll do in a lot of my illustrations, but having extra sort of thickness to your line art to separate one object from another can really help, depending how much detail you want to do in your shading. So here, I'm going to do that big thick bit of line art around that separates the object from the background, or from the character from the background. That's going to be the thing that carves it out the most. And so I'll go around the whole thing, trying to have nice, big, smooth strokes, and just go through and do the thickest one first. Now it's also a great opportunity to get any bits of line art that I've missed, like that bit of the hair there that I didn't catch, and just going over and getting all those big, thick bits there. And so again, I'll speed this bit up, so I can get all those nice, thick bits that are separating this object from the background behind it. Now if you just want to do this instead of all the other kinds of line art, that's good too. It's especially good for things like design, like graphic design and stickers, where you want that immediate visual separation and that immediate visual hierarchy of object separated from object. And then I'll have the internal ones as well, where it'll be some line art that's not as thick as that thick one on the very outside, but still thicker than the naive line art I've done on the inside. Now with all them together, you can see it's pretty nice line art. Now to add some tone then, to make this a real line art piece, what I'm going to do is I'll do some contour lines to simulate things like shading and tone. So I'll first have to decide where I want that, and whether I'm going to be doing things like darkening the hair overall, or what I'm going to do there. So again, this brush that I'm using here is linked in the description. It's just to save you the effort of going dot 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 on your tablet and sort of nailing the tip of your stylus in, or nailing the tip of your pen in. I know I had to do a lot of stippling works back at uni, and it cost me an absolute fortune in annihilated felt tip markers, because you just sort of hammer the tip of them all the way back into the barrel. I'm trying a bit of contour on the leaves here, realizing that I had the contour the wrong way. A bit more, and just in those darkest little bits where it sort of joins in against the flower. And now I'll do some to add tone. So here, I want the patterning to be a pale color, or pale, and then I want the stuff behind it to be darker. So I'm using these dots, the contour lines, to add tone. And you can see it still does add tone, while also at the same time giving me a clear communication of the shape of the object as well. And so I'm doing the same thing on the eyes here, and some thick parts, and some lines, and some dots. And then on the hair as well, and on the side of the face, I'm doing some of the sort of blush marks with just some lines there, and some contour lines under the chin that are following the shape, as well as the lines here for the hair shading. You can see I'm following the line of where the hair would be. That's the contour. That's that surface, and where the surface is sort of directed. And the same thing here on the chest and around the waistband there. And I'm just trying to add tone while still imagining that I'm simply wrapping it in these lines, like the mesh you see on 3D models, where it has those contour lines that wrap the object, and they really communicate its three-dimensional shape even when there's no shading. And so here I'm using the contour lines to show the shape, but only where there would be shadow. So I'm using it to add tone, but also communicate form. And a bit more to show things like the bag on the waist there. Trying for a metal texture as well, as the bits of ambient occlusion like in the center of the hand where the fingers are folded in. And then on the inside edge of the skirt and dress there. And you can also see I'm using variation in width to give me variation in value and tone. And whenever I have a section with a lot of lines, you'll notice I'll split it up and then work in those divisions to keep the lines fairly regular. And I can add extra bits between those lines if I want to have like a darker section like I did there. And just trying to have all these lines match up with the direction of the hair that they're on. And you can also use the magic wand tool to sort of section bits off, so you just work on one bit at a time. And so like here, using those simple strokes within those areas I've got with magic wand tool. And then here, to save myself a bit of time, I'll do one of these with a lot of effort. And then I'm going to copy that and put it on the other areas and just sort of tune in and fill in the gaps. And here I'm doing the same thing to get those extra little bits there. And so I want some tone in that bit behind the character, but I don't want it to be as dark as the tone on those little sort of circle plates. So I'm doing the lines, but I'm doing them much further apart, so they will still add tone, but a much more gentle tone. And now I'm doing the contour on the leaves, realizing that the problem was before that I had the contours going the wrong way around the leaves. And then do a bit of ambient shadow there from the hand as it gets close to the hair. And with that, I've got it done. So I'll add some paper texture. And once I've done the paper texture, I'll make a merged copy of my line art. I'll blur it, and I'll color it. And that way I can have that sort of sepia-toned scroll, like that old sort of font look. So I'll give it a sort of reddish color on top of the sort of parchment paper pattern. And then I'll duplicate it, I'll blur it, make sure they're both set to multiply, and then I'll lower the opacity down so the effect's not too strong. And with that, it's looking pretty close to done. So I'm just making sure I'm happy with the balance of it. It looks good. And so here you can see, I've got the whole thing done, but I haven't used any colors. I haven't used any shading necessarily, although I have used contour and lots of regular either lines or broken lines to darken the image in certain places. And it has a very sort of old illustrative text vibe, like if you had like an old magic spellbook kind of look to it with the paper texture and the brown there and those sort of swirling patterns. Because you didn't used to be able to do gradients is the thing. Now, that's how to do that. And for those of you who've been waiting for the secret of my brush, let's get into that. So you've probably noticed the sketching brush. Now I did put out a video on how I do my sketching brush. That's just the hard round brush, but a lot of you kept asking. And you must have known that I was hiding the secret of all my power. So, here it is. This is the sketching brush. You can see the name of it there is the Brush Emmy. What is it? How does it work? So first, what you'll have to do is get your musical notes effect brush. Using that, quickly block out and then detail in a photorealistic portrait of Steve Buscemi using only the musical notes effect brush. Once you've done that and finish that image, save that as an image material and then use that as the pattern, as the brush tip shape for a brush. And that's how you do it. So the brush I've been using this entire time has been a picture of Steve Buscemi that I drew using the musical notes effect brush. And what's the point I'm saying with this? That the brush doesn't matter. Now there are times, like with the contour brush, where it can be really helpful, but for the most part, the brush you use does not matter. You can use basically anything. So, try not to spend all your time trying to find the right brush, spend that time drawing, and you get much better results. Now, with that done, if you want to have a go yourself, I've got the homework sheet that's linked in the description. You can have a go at that one. You can do it digitally. If you don't have a way to do it digitally, use like a light box and a pen. Baking paper works just as well as tracing paper, and it's significantly cheaper, just so you know. And once you've done that, scan, photo, pop it into the Discord. I go through there as often as I can and mark through them. Like I said before, there's a few of you now, so it takes me a little longer than it used to, but I'm still managing to get through it. Still can, just. And yes, if you like the video, hit like, hit subscribe. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a member on our Patreon. A lot of the artworks for the channel I've done for like the Speedpaints, they're available on the Redbubble, so if you want a poster or a hat or a beanbag or God knows what else they sell, you have that option there as well. And of course we've got classes. The new intake will be starting probably around January, depending on sort of how the drop-off goes. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. You have a good day. Cheers. Bye.